The desert was merciless that afternoon. A pale sheet of heat stretched between the sky and the earth, the air shimmering like glass above the cracked soil. Jacob Holt rode slowly, his hat tipped low to keep the sun off his eyes, his horse breathing heavy from hours without shade. He hadn't planned to be out this far, but a missing calf had led him past the ridge, then a storm had driven him deeper still. By the time he turned home, the sun was already sinking behind the jagged red cliffs. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the heat, a shimmer or a shadow cast by a boulder. But as he drew closer, he saw a figure lying in the sand, the faint flutter of fabric, the pale glint of a hand reaching weakly toward the sky. His chest tightened. Jacob slid down from his horse and ran, his boots crunching over dry earth. The woman was half buried in the dust, her dress torn, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her skin was hot as fire to the touch, her breathing shallow. He brushed sand from her hair, light brown streaked with gold tangled by wind, and her eyes opened slightly, dazed and unfocused. "Please, don't leave me here to die," she whispered, voice breaking. Those words hit him hard, not because they were desperate, but because they sounded like surrender. She wasn't fighting anymore. "You're not dying today," Jacob said firmly, slipping his arm under her shoulders. "Not while I'm here." He pulled her against him and carried her toward his horse. She was light, too light, like she hadn't eaten in days. Her pulse flickered weakly against his wrist. Whoever she was, she'd been through hell. He lifted her gently into the saddle and mounted behind her, holding her steady as he turned the horse toward the North Canyon, toward shelter. The ride was long. The wind picked up, throwing grit into their faces. Every few minutes he checked her breathing. Once she stirred and mumbled something, and a name, maybe, or a place. But the words were lost to the wind. When they finally reached the small line shack near his grazing land, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The air cooled quickly, the smell of sage and dust mixing with twilight. Jacob carried her inside, laid her on the narrow bed and covered her with his blanket. Then he lit a lamp and set a kettle on the stove. As the light flickered over her face, he could see the bruises, dark marks on her wrist, the faint imprint of rope around her arm. His jaw tightened. Whoever left her out there hadn't just abandoned her. They'd meant for her not to be found. He cleaned her wounds with gentle care, his hands steady despite the anger rising in his chest. Her face softened as the fever began to ease, her breathing slowing into shallow, uneven sleep. Jacob sat beside her most of the night, watching the firelight dance across the walls. Outside, coyotes howled across the canyon, and his horse stomped nervously in the corral. Every sound made him reach for his revolver, but the only thing that mattered was the fragile rhythm of her breathing. When dawn broke, the first thing he saw was her eyes, open, clear this time, though still weak. They were a soft green, full of confusion and fear. Where am I?" she whispered. "Safe," Jacob said quietly. "You're at my line shack. Found you out in the desert. You've been out cold since last night." She blinked, trying to sit up, but winced and fell back. "I remember a wagon," men shouting. And then, "Don't force it," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now. You need water." He lifted a tin cup to her lips, steadying her as she drank. When she was done, she looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read his soul. "Why did you stop?" she asked softly. "You didn't have to," Jacob hesitated. "I couldn't just ride past," he said finally. "Not when someone needed help." Something like gratitude flickered in her gaze, but it was mixed with sorrow. "Most men would have," she murmured. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. He'd seen too much of what men did out here. How easy it was to turn away, to let cruelty pass because it wasn't your problem. But Jacob Holt wasn't built that way. When she slept again, Jacob stepped outside to feed the horse and fetch water. The morning air was cool, the world silent except for the crackle of distant grasshoppers. But when he returned, she was awake, sitting up this time, wrapped in his old wool blanket. "I'm Emma," she said softly, her voice still raspy. "Emma Collins," he nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "Jacob Holt," she looked down at her hands. "I was traveling west with my uncle. He owed money. Bad men came for it. I tried to run. They caught me." Her breath hitched. "They thought leaving me in the desert would teach him a lesson." Jacob's stomach turned cold. "And your uncle?" "I don't know," she whispered. "Maybe dead by now." For a long moment, silence hung between them, heavy as thunderclouds. Then Jacob said quietly, "They won't touch you again." "Not while I'm here." Emma's eyes met his. She believed him. Maybe it was the way he said it, not like a promise, but like a simple truth. The days that followed were quiet. Emma healed slowly, her color returning bit by bit. Jacob hunted rabbits and brewed strong coffee. She mended his torn shirts and cleaned the shack, though he told her she didn't have to. She smiled more often now. Soft, shy smiles that tugged at something deep in his chest. Sometimes, when the evening wind swept through the valley, they'd sit outside together watching the sky turn from gold to violet. She'd tell him small things about her mother's garden, about the blue ribbons she used to win at church fairs, and then he'd listen, content just to hear her voice. One night, as the stars spread across the black sky, Emma turned to him and said quietly, "You saved my life. Jacob, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said, his voice low. "But I do," she whispered. "Because when I woke up out there, I didn't want to keep living. I thought no one would ever come." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not just the woman he'd rescued, but the strength it took to survive what she'd been through. "I came," he said simply. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening in the firelight. "Yes, you did." And for the first time in years, Jacob Holt felt something stir in his chest, something gentle and alive, something he'd long thought buried under dust and regret. As the night deepened, he watched her drift to sleep by the fire, her face peaceful, her hand resting just inches from his. He didn't touch her. Not yet. But the unspoken feeling hung between them like a promise neither dared to name. He looked toward the stars and whispered to himself, "Whatever it takes. I'll keep her safe," he meant it, even if it cost him everything. Morning light spilled across the valley like liquid gold, soft and warm against the cabin's rough wooden walls. Jacob rose early as he always did, his boots thudding softly on the floorboards. Emma was still asleep on the bed, her breathing steady now, the fever long gone. He paused before stepping outside, watching how a stray curl had fallen across her cheek, how the sun touched her skin like it had chosen her alone. It had been nearly a week since he'd found her. Each day she'd grown stronger. She could stand now, even help him around the cabin. Her laughter had begun to fill the quiet. Shy at first, then brighter, like a song he'd forgotten the words to. Jacob saddled his horse and rode out to check the herd. But his thoughts kept circling back to the woman inside his cabin. He wasn't used to this kind of worry. Not the practical kind that came with cattle and fences, but the deep, aching kind that came with caring for someone you barely knew yet couldn't bear to lose. When he returned near noon, the smell of cornbread met him at the door. Emma stood at the small table, hair tied back with a strip of cloth, sunlight glowing against her shoulders. She turned when she heard the door open, smiling softly. "You were gone a while," she said, setting the loaf on the table. "Had to mend a fence," he replied, pulling off his gloves. "Something spooked the herd last night." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Coyotes?" He hesitated. Maybe, but he wasn't sure. The tracks he'd seen near the water trough were too large. Boot prints, not paw marks. Emma caught the change in his voice but didn't press him. Instead, she handed him a cup of coffee, her fingers brushing his. For a moment, the world narrowed to that small, quiet touch. Then she pulled away, pretending not to notice the warmth that lingered between them. They ate together, mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable one. When she laughed, a soft, musical sound that filled the cabin, Jacob found himself smiling before he realized it. After lunch, she insisted on helping him with chores outside. He tried to argue, but she was stubborn. "I can't just sit inside all day," she said, tying her shawl tighter against the wind. "Besides, I owe you for everything." He shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing." But she followed him anyway, her boots crunching beside his. Together they repaired a gate and carried water to the trough. Her hands were smaller than his, delicate but steady. She wasn't afraid of the work, though her dress soon gathered dust and her sleeves were streaked with sweat. At one point, as she bent to lift a bucket, she stumbled, and he caught her by the waist. For a heartbeat, they froze like that. His hands on her sides, her breath quick against his chest. Their eyes met, and the world around them seemed to stop. "Careful," he murmured, voice rougher than he meant it to be. Her cheeks flushed, But she didn't step back right away. "Guess I'm still getting used to walking on solid ground again," she said with a faint smile. When she finally pulled away, Jacob felt the ghost of her warmth still under his hands. Later that afternoon, while she washed at the creek, he climbed the ridge to scan the horizon. The land stretched wide and quiet, but in the distance he saw movement. 3 riders faint against the shimmering heat. They were too far to make out clearly, but something in his gut twisted. He went back to the cabin, loading his rifle with slow, deliberate motions. Emma was sitting by the fire when he came in, humming softly as she sewed a tear in his shirt. She looked up at the sound of the gun's click. "What is it?" she asked. "Could be nothing," he said. "Just a few riders out near the ridge." Her face went pale. 3 of them. He turned sharply. "You saw them?" "No." Her hands trembled slightly. "But the men who took me, there were 3. A tall one with a scar over his eye. Another who whistled through his teeth when he talked. And the last one," she swallowed hard. He laughed the whole time. Jacob felt cold all over. "If it's them, they won't get close. Not while I'm breathing." That night, he didn't sleep. He sat near the window, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Emma stirred once, murmuring his name in her sleep, a soft, broken sound that made something twist inside him. By dawn, the riders were gone. No sign of them, no tracks near the cabin, but Jacob's unease didn't fade. He knew how men like that worked. They circled like wolves, waiting for the right moment. Days passed. Emma sensed his tension, though he tried to hide it. She began asking gentle questions, trying to learn more about the man who'd saved her. He told her bits and pieces, how he'd been raised on a ranch near Abilene, how the war had taken his brothers, how he'd come west to start over. She listened quietly, her green eyes soft with understanding. One evening, as the wind howled outside, she said quietly, "You've lost a lot, haven't you?" He nodded. "Enough to stop expecting much from the world." She studied him for a long moment. "And yet, you still stop for me." Jacob looked at her then, really looked, and saw not the fragile woman he'd rescued, but someone with strength carved from pain like herself. "Guess I couldn't help it," he said. "Didn't want the desert to take another soul." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, something that made the air feel charged, like the calm before lightning. When she smiled, it was soft and trembling. "You saved my life, Jacob, but sometimes I think you saved more than that." He didn't answer, and their words felt too small for what he felt. Instead, he reached out, his calloused fingers brushing a stray curl from her face. She didn't move away. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment he thought she might lean into his touch. But then she whispered, "I'm scared they'll come back." His voice was steady when he said, "Let them." "I'll be ready." She opened her eyes, searching his face. "You'd risk yourself for me?" He didn't hesitate. "Already did." The silence that followed was deep and trembling. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant echo of thunder. Inside, Emma's eyes glistened with something that wasn't just fear. It was the slow, fragile beginning of trust. As the fire burned low, she moved closer, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "Then I'll stay," she whispered. "As long as you'll have me." Jacob swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You can stay as long as you want, and just like that." Something changed. A quiet vow beneath the crackling firelight. Sealed not with words, but with the soft, lingering look they shared before sleep took them both. Outside, far beyond the ridge, 3 riders camped in the dark, their laughter drifting faintly on the wind. But inside that small cabin, warmth bloomed, fragile, fierce, and real. Jacob knew what was coming. And he knew one thing for certain. He would protect Emma Collins, even if it cost him everything. The wind carried the scent of rain across the valley that morning. Dark clouds were gathering above the cliffs, pressing low and heavy, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Jacob stood on the porch, rifle leaning against the post, eyes scanning the horizon. Every instinct in him said trouble was near. Inside, Emma moved quietly about the cabin, humming under her breath as she swept the floor. The small home had become warmer these past weeks, not just from the fire, but from the life she brought into it. Her laughter, the sound of her voice reading from his worn Bible in the evenings, the way she smiled when he handed her a wildflower he'd found along the trail. But beneath the peace, something darker stirred. Jacob had seen the riders again, 3 silhouettes against the ridge, just far enough to make their presence a taunt. He hadn't told her yet. He couldn't. Not until he knew for sure. When she stepped out onto the porch, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek, he forced a smile. "Storm's rolling in," he said. "Best stay close today." She nodded, her gaze lifting toward the clouds. "It smells like Texas rain," she said softly. "Warm and heavy. You miss it?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "But maybe I was meant to end up here." He looked at her then, at the quiet strength in her eyes, the way her dress moved gently in the wind. And for a heartbeat, he believed it too. As the day wore on, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and stirring dust across the plain. They worked side by side to bring the animals in and secure the barn. Emma's skirts were soaked by the time the first drops fell, her laughter echoing through the rain as she helped Jacob tie down the feed sacks. "You don't listen much, do you?" he called over the storm. She smiled, cheeks flushed and wet with rain. "Not when there's work to be done." Jacob couldn't help it. He laughed, really laughed, the sound raw and full. For a moment, the world was just that. Rain, laughter, and 2 hearts that had somehow found each other in all the emptiness. But the storm wasn't the only thing brewing. That night, after they'd dried off and the fire burned low, Jacob heard it, a faint creak of wood outside, the soft shuffle of boots against mud. His hand went instantly to his rifle. Emma's eyes met his, wide and frightened. "Stay inside," he whispered. She grabbed his arm. "Jacob, I mean it, Emma. Lock the door." He slipped out into the darkness, rain falling cold against his skin. The yard was slick, the ground swallowing the sound of his boots. Lightning flashed, and for a split second he saw them. 3 men near the corral, one holding the reins of a stolen horse. "Who's there?" Jacob shouted, raising the rifle. The answer came as a bullet. It whistled past his ear, splintering the post beside him. He fired back, the crack of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. One man cursed, diving behind the trough. Another darted toward the barn. Jacob moved fast, heart pounding. He ducked behind the wagon, counting the flashes of lightning. When the next one came, he fired again, hit one of them in the shoulder. The man dropped his gun with a howl. Then, through the chaos, he heard it, a voice that made his blood boil. Well, the hero cowboy," the man sneered, stepping from the shadows. The scar over his left eye gleamed when lightning flashed. "Didn't figure you'd still be breathing, Holt." Jacob's jaw clenched. "You must be Hank Mercer." The man grinned, teeth yellow in the dark. "She tell you about me? Pretty little thing, ain't she? Shame what we had to do. Business, you understand?" "You left her to die," Jacob growled. Hank shrugged. "Wasn't my idea. But now she's with you. Guess we can call it even. We just want what she took." Jacob narrowed his eyes. "She didn't take anything." The man chuckled. "Oh, she did. My boss's ledger. Names, debts, deals. Worth a whole lot more than that woman's life." Jacob blinked. Ledger. He looked back toward the cabin. Emma, pale and frightened in the flickering lamplight. She told him her uncle owed money, that bad men came for it. But she hadn't said anything about stolen records. Another shot rang out, grazing Jacob's arm. He ducked behind the wagon again, gritting his teeth. "Next one won't miss," Hank yelled. "Hand her over, cowboy, and maybe we'll let you ride away." Jacob's voice came out like gravel. "You'll have to kill me first." "Gladly." The fight raged through the night. Rain turned the ground to mud. Lightning flashed across the ridge and gunfire cracked like thunder. At last, one of the outlaws went down, Jacob's shot catching him square in the chest. The second fled into the darkness, dragging the wounded one with him. But Hank didn't retreat. He stood there, breathing hard, his gun aimed at Jacob's heart. "Didn't have to be this way," he hissed. "Yeah," Jacob said, lifting his rifle. "It did." Both fired at the same time. The world went white. When the smoke cleared, Hank lay still in the mud, his gun a few feet from his hand. Jacob staggered back, clutching his side where the bullet had grazed him. The cabin door flew open, and Emma ran toward him, her face pale as snow. "Jacob?" He caught her before she fell, his knees buckling under her weight and his own pain. "It's all right," he whispered, forcing a smile. "They're gone." Tears mixed with rain as she pressed her hands against his wound. "You're bleeding." "Just a scratch," he lied. "Don't you dare lie to me now," she said, her voice trembling. He laughed softly, the sound ragged. Guess you know me too well already. She held him close, her forehead against his chest, whispering through her tears. You saved me again. Jacob looked down at her, his vision blurring, but even through the pain he managed to smile. Worth every bullet. That night she cleaned and bandaged his wound, her hands shaking. When he finally drifted to sleep, she sat beside him, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. She thought of how close she'd come to losing him, and how much that thought terrified her. As dawn crept in, painting the sky with pale gold, Emma took the small leather pouch from her satchel, the one she'd kept hidden since the desert. Inside was a folded paper ledger, stained and worn. She stared at it for a long moment, then whispered, "No more running." She tucked it under Jacob's hand and said softly, "You saved me, Jacob, now it's my turn." Outside, the land lay quiet again, but peace was fragile and the storm had only just begun. Morning light crept slowly through the cabin windows, soft and golden, spilling across the floor where Jacob lay sleeping. His bandaged side rose and fell with shallow, steady breaths. Emma sat beside him, her fingers curled gently around his hand, tracing the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He had nearly died for her. Again. The memory of last night was still raw. The gunfire, the rain, the flash of lightning that turned night to fire. She had watched him stand between her and death, had seen him fall into the mud bleeding, and something inside her had broken open. He wasn't just the man who had saved her life. He was the only man who had ever made her feel safe. When his eyes finally opened, hazy with pain but sharp as ever, she managed a trembling smile. "You're awake." "Guess I am," he said, voice rough. He tried to sit up but hissed as the wound pulled. "Don't," she said quickly, pressing him back down. "You lost a lot of blood." He gave her a faint smile. "You're still here. Guess I can't complain." Emma looked down, her eyes shining with something she hadn't dared to say out loud. "Where else would I be?" Jacob studied her for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted to the small leather pouch lying on the table, the one she'd placed in his hand before dawn. "That yours?" She hesitated, then nodded. "You should know the truth." He said nothing, just watched her, his eyes steady and patient. She opened the pouch and pulled out the folded papers, spreading them across the table. "This is what they wanted," she said softly. "My uncle worked for a man named Mercer, the one with the scar. He ran gambling dens and loaned money to ranchers who couldn't pay it back. When folks fell behind, he'd take their land, or their lives." Jacob's jaw tightened. "When my uncle found out Mercer was cheating people, he tried to stop him," she continued. "He copied this ledger, names, debts, proof of every lie, and told me to keep it safe. Said if anything happened, I should take it to the law in Tucson." Her voice broke. "They found us before we could get there." Jacob's eyes darkened. "That's why they left you in the desert. They thought killing you would bury the truth with you." Emma nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid. If they knew you had me, they'd come after you too." He leaned back, grimacing with pain but never looking away. "You should have told me." "I wanted to," she whispered, "but I couldn't stand the thought of you getting hurt." He looked at her for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. "Emma, you can't live looking over your shoulder forever. If we run, they'll find us. If we hide, they'll come again. We end this." She shook her head, terrified. "You're in no condition to fight." "Don't matter." His voice was calm, solid as bedrock. "They'll come back soon, and when they do, I'll be ready." Tears filled her eyes. "You don't have to do this for me." Jacob looked at her then, his expression softening. "I ain't doing it just for you." He paused. "I'm doing it because I can't stand the thought of a world where a woman like you has to live in fear." Her heart twisted. "Jacob," he reached for her hand, his fingers rough but gentle. "You've got a choice, Emma. You can keep running or you can fight. I'll stand with you either way." Her throat tightened. For so long her life had been running. From men, from fear, from loss. But looking at him now, lying wounded and still ready to fight for her, she realized something she hadn't before. She didn't want to run anymore. She took his hand and pressed it to her chest. "Then we fight," she whispered. "Together." That evening, the sky turned red as blood over the desert. Jacob stood weakly beside the barn, bracing himself against the post while Emma checked the rifle cartridges he'd taught her to load. The wind was dry again, carrying the faint smell of rain and gunpowder. "You sure about this?" she asked, glancing at him. "Never been more sure of anything," he said. They set up lanterns around the cabin, their flickering light casting long shadows across the dirt. Jacob planned every detail: where to take cover, how to draw them in, how Emma should signal him if she saw movement first. When the sun disappeared, they waited. The night stretched long and silent. The desert held its breath. Even the crickets seemed to have gone still. Emma sat by the window, rifle across her lap, eyes scanning the darkness. Jacob sat nearby, listening to the faint rustle of wind through the dry grass. Then came the sound. Distant at first, then closer. Hoofbeats. 3 of them. Emma's grip tightened. "They're here." Jacob nodded once. "Remember what I told you. Don't hesitate." Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear him. 3 riders appeared out of the dark, their torches glowing like devil's fire. One carried a white handkerchief tied to his gun belt, the mark of Mercer's gang. They stopped just short of the cabin, their voices low and mocking. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. "You boys don't learn easy, do you?" The leader sneered. "You killed our boss. We aim to return the favor." Jacob raised his weapon. "Then you'd best start praying." The night exploded with gunfire. The first man dropped fast, Emma's shot from the window catching him square in the chest. Jacob fired next, clipping the second in the shoulder. The third rushed forward, shouting curses, but Jacob met him halfway, tackling him into the mud. They struggled, fists in fury, until Jacob slammed the man's head against the ground, ending it. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of the wind. Emma rushed out, rifle shaking in her hands. "Jacob." He turned, chest heaving, mud streaked across his face. "You did good," he said, voice hoarse. She stared at the fallen men, her breath coming fast. "Is it over?" "For now," he said. "But we can't stay here. Not after this." She looked around the small cabin, their home, built on chance and healing. "Where will we go?" He stepped closer, brushing rain and dust from her cheek. "Doesn't matter, long as you're with me." Something in his voice broke her. She pressed her face against his chest, sobbing quietly, clutching his shirt like she could hold the whole world together if she just didn't let go. When she looked up, his eyes were on hers, dark, steady, and full of something too deep for words. He leaned in slowly, his hand brushing the back of her neck, and this time she didn't pull away. Their lips met, soft at first, then desperate, full of everything they'd both been afraid to say. It was a promise, a vow, a beginning born from fire. When they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his. "What now?" she whispered. Jacob smiled faintly. "Now we finish what your uncle started." She nodded, wiping her tears. "Then we'll go to Tucson." He looked toward the horizon where the first light of dawn was beginning to rise. "We'll ride at sunrise," he said, and as the new day broke over the wounded land, Jacob Holt and Emma Collins stood side by side. 2 souls bound by fate and fire, ready to fight for love, for justice, and for the life they'd both nearly lost. The road to Tucson stretched long and lonely beneath the rising sun, a ribbon of dust cutting through endless miles of gold and red. Jacob and Emma rode side by side, their horses' hooves drumming a slow rhythm on the hard earth. Behind them, the small cabin, their shelter, their battlefield, their beginning, disappeared into the desert haze. Emma looked back only once. The sight of it made her throat tighten, but she turned forward again, her gaze steady. There was no room for regret now. The time for hiding was over. Jacob rode quietly, one hand resting on the reins, the other pressed lightly against his bandaged side. He was healing, but not quickly enough for her liking. Every time he winced, she wanted to stop and make him rest. Every time he smiled through the pain, she loved him more for it, and hated the world that had made him so used to carrying it alone. By noon, the heat shimmered off the ground like glass. They stopped by a dry creek bed to water the horses and share a canteen. Emma knelt by Jacob, dabbing a cloth against his forehead. "You should have stayed," she murmured, "and let you ride into danger alone." He shook his head. "You don't know me very well, do you?" She gave a small, exasperated smile. "I know you better than anyone." He looked at her then, really looked, at the freckles across her nose, the strands of hair stuck to her cheek. the way her eyes held light even in the dust and heat. "Yeah," he said softly. "I reckon you do." They reached Tucson near sunset. The town was alive with sound. Wagons clattering, blacksmiths hammering, children laughing in the streets. It had been weeks since either of them had seen so many faces. For Emma, it felt like walking back into the world after living too long at its edge. They rented a small room above the general store, where Jacob could rest while Emma sought out the sheriff. He protested, of course, but she silenced him with a look that left no room for argument. "I've run from these men long enough," she said. "I'll face them, but I'll do it the right way." He studied her, then nodded. "All right. Just be careful." She squeezed his hand. "I've learned from the best." The sheriff's office was a plain wooden building, the flag out front faded by sun and dust. Sheriff Calhoun was a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, his gray beard trimmed neatly. He listened in silence as Emma laid the ledger on his desk, her voice trembling as she told him everything. The debts, the threats, the killings, the men who'd left her for dead. When she finished, Calhoun leaned back, whistling low. "You got yourself a storm here, Miss Collins. But it's the kind that needs to break." He tapped the ledger. "This'll put a lot of men in jail, maybe even save a few lives. You done right bringing it here?" Emma let out a shaky breath. "Then it's over?" "Not quite," he said. "Mercer's partners won't sit quiet once they find out he's dead. They'll come sniffing for whoever turned that ledger in, but don't you worry, we'll keep you safe." She thanked him and turned to leave, only to freeze as the door swung open. 3 men stepped inside. Dusty, rough, their eyes sharp with recognition. One of them smiled, a cruel, familiar smile. Well, he drawled. "If it ain't the lady who ran from the desert." Before she could react, the sheriff's gun was out. "Drop your irons," he barked, but the men moved fast. The room exploded with noise, gunfire, shouting, chaos. Emma ducked behind the desk, heart pounding. She saw Calhoun go down, clutching his shoulder. One outlaw crashed through the window, another charged toward her, and then, from the street came another gunshot. Deep, unmistakable Jacob. He stood in the doorway, rifle smoking, his face pale but his aim steady. "Get away from her," he growled. The outlaw turned, sneering. "You again?" Jacob fired once more. The man dropped. "Emma!" he shouted, rushing to her side. "You all right?" She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "You shouldn't have come." "I couldn't stay away," he said simply. 2 more men burst through the back door. Jacob turned, firing again, but the recoil jolted his wound. He stumbled, grimacing in pain. The last man lunged forward, grabbing Emma and pressing a gun to her throat. "Drop it," the outlaw hissed. Jacob froze. His finger hovered on the trigger, but his hand didn't shake. "Let her go," the man laughed. "You're not in charge here, cowboy." Emma's pulse thundered. She could feel the metal of the gun against her skin, smell the sour sweat of the man holding her, and then she remembered Jacob's words, "Don't hesitate." She stomped hard on the outlaw's boot and twisted away just as Jacob fired. The bullet caught the man square in the chest. He fell, dragging Emma down with him. Silence. The only sound was Jacob's ragged breathing as he lowered the rifle. Emma looked up from the floor, trembling, then scrambled toward him. "Jacob." He caught her in his arms, holding her tight. "You're safe now," he whispered. "It's over." The sheriff groaned from where he lay, pressing a cloth to his wound. "Reckon you two just saved this town a heap of trouble," he muttered. "We'll take it from here." Jacob nodded, exhaustion etched across his face. Emma reached up and touched his cheek, her voice soft but steady. "You always keep your promises," he smiled faintly. "Told you I would." Days passed. The outlaws were buried, the ledger sent east as evidence. Sheriff Calhoun offered them a reward for their help, but Jacob refused it. "We've got enough," he said simply. They stayed in Tucson until his wound healed completely. Emma spent her mornings helping at the sheriff's office, her afternoons tending to Jacob and planning what came next. Sometimes, when the heat of the day faded into the cool lavender of evening, they'd walk together along the edge of town, hand in hand. One night, as the stars stretched wide across the desert sky, Jacob stopped and looked at her, his expression quiet but full. "You ever think about settling?" he asked. She smiled. "All the time. Just never thought I'd have someone to settle with." He stepped closer, brushing a stray curl from her face. "You do now," her eyes softened. "Jacob Holt, are you asking me what I think you're asking?" He chuckled low, that warm sound she loved so much. Guess I am, her heart swelled. Then my answer's yes. Always yes. He pulled her close and she wrapped her arms around him, feeling his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her cheek. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite, carrying the faint scent of rain. When he kissed her, it wasn't like the desperate, wounded kiss from before. It was slow, tender, the kind that spoke of forever. Months later, the cabin stood rebuilt, stronger than before. The land around it bloomed with wildflowers after a rare spring rain. 2 horses grazed by the corral, and from inside the small home came the sound of laughter, the kind that fills empty places and makes them whole. Jacob stood at the door, watching Emma kneel by the hearth, her hair gleaming in the firelight. She turned and smiled at him, and in that moment he felt something deep in his chest. Peace. The kind a man finds once in a lifetime if he's lucky. You thinking again? She teased gently. He smiled. Just remembering. About what? The first time I saw you, out there in the desert. Thought you were a mirage. She rose and crossed the room, wrapping her arms around him. Maybe I was. Until you believed I could be real. He kissed her forehead, holding her close. I'd do it all over again, he whispered. She looked up at him, eyes shining. Even if it cost you everything? He smiled softly. It already did, but what I got in return was worth it. And as the sun set over the endless horizon, painting the land in gold and crimson, Jacob Holt and Emma Collins stood together, 2 hearts that had found love in a place where hope was supposed to die. She had once whispered, "Please don't leave me here to die." And he never did. He had saved her life. But she had given him something far greater, a reason to live.